Well, thank you so much, Joseph, for this very kind introduction and entertaining as well. And thank you also, Brother Jerome, and the whole Thomistic Institute team here at Oxford for the invitation to deliver this talk. As you know, I'm a fellow of All Souls College, and All Souls is a research-only institution within the University of Oxford. And so my job primarily involves reading and writing. So there's not a lot of exposition to students, at least not compared to other colleges, which makes this opportunity all the more exciting to me. And thank you all here too, for being here. Of course, there's a very nice talk going on about the conclave. We're about to start, but I'm just impressed to see so many of you here on an evening of a bank holiday to hear about dead bodies. So I hope you enjoy it. So imagine that you are in a medieval Gothic church and seeing a few nuns opening the body of their dead abbess. Sounds horrible, right? Well, this very episode occurred in 1308 in Italy, and it is at the roots of a major yet slow revolution in the history of medicine. I have been learning about cases like this since I started my studies in the history of science and medicine, and as you can imagine, I have never stopped being interested in them. And this talk is in part how my fascination with this theme has emerged. But before explaining why these cases are so interesting to a historian of science, let me start with another case from the Renaissance. So on the morning of May 26, 1595, exactly 430 years ago today, the devout Catholic priest Philip Neri died in Rome. His body was brought back to the Chiesa Nuova. Let me turn this on. There you go. His body was brought back to the Chiesa Nuova, the mother church of the Congregation of the Oratory, the institution that Philip Neri had founded. And throughout the day, cardinals, bishops, and many faithful of Rome came to the church to pray before his body. And that night, almost 24 hours after Philip died, the church was closed and everyone left, except for a select group of about 30 people. These people were Oratorian priests, the members of the congregation that Philip had founded, a few lay disciples of Philip Neri, and the protagonists of the evening, 3 physicians, 2 surgeons, and 1 pharmacist. In front of everyone, these medical experts opened Philip Neri's body to find out that his heart was extraordinarily enlarged, which explained why 2 ribs around the heart were broken. And it did not take long for everyone to associate Philip's enlarged heart with his intense love for God. The next day, after more crowds came to church to pray, his disciples buried his body. 4 years later, the body was exhumed. They found parts of the coffin rotten and the vestments broken into dust. The body, however, was found in a state of unusual physical preservation, as officially confirmed by 4 doctors, some of whom had already testified about his heart. Saint Philip Neri, therefore, is one of the many saints whose bodies, because they did not decompose, are known as incorrupt bodies. Now, to our modern minds, incorrupt bodies seem greatly suspicious. Is it God making this miracle? Could the body not have been preserved by natural conditions, or perhaps secretly embalmed? What does science say about this phenomenon? These questions, which all Catholics are welcome to have, seem to place incorrupt bodies in contrast with modern science. Modern science thrives on rigor, certainty, and empirical proofs. Incorrupt bodies, on the other hand, are surrounded by popular piety, ambiguity, and Catholicism, a religion often accused of hindering scientific progress. In this talk, contrary to the assumption that religious devotion to incorrupt bodies is at odds with science, I argue that there has never been a moment in history when they have been separated. And here's my disclaimer, okay? So this is not a talk about the scientific explanation or lack thereof of the incorruption of dead bodies. It is a talk about history. I will show that this continuous union between science and holy corpses has affected both religious and scientific histories profoundly. Science shaped the official attitude of the Catholic Church towards holy corpses, However, devotion to holy corpses also had an impact on science, particularly in the history of anatomy. Indeed, the presence of physicians in the autopsy of Saint Philip Neri is but one example of how the Church has persistently relied on scientific expertise in examining holy corpses. And so in tonight's talk, I will present various encounters between holy corpses and science. And it is my hope to use them to also teach you something, not just about the history of religion, but also about the history of science more generally. So before looking at our first incorrupt body, let me start with a fundamental episode in the history of medicine. Today, most of modern physiology hinges on the knowledge that blood circulates inside our body. However, the circulation of the blood was only discovered in the 1610s by the English physician William Harvey, and in fact published only for the first time in 1628. And how is it possible, you now ask, that such a fundamental fact of human physiology was discovered so late? Why was anatomy so behind in a time in which Kepler and Galileo were moving science forward with novel experiments and mathematics? I have been asked this question many times as a historian of science. And my answer as a historian of science is always that Harvey's discovery must be read in context. Harvey discovered the circulation because he was benefiting from a new and historically unprecedented rise in the practice of anatomical dissections. But then you may also ask, why were dissections on the rise only in the late Renaissance and not before that? But this question too is somewhat misleading because it assumes that dissections should be practiced in science. However, in human history, dissections were almost never used in the study of anatomy. In late antiquity and in the Middle Ages, when dissections were almost never practiced, university students learned anatomy from the works of Galen of Pergamon, an ancient Greek physician who wrote many and groundbreaking medical works. Now, Galen's books were so important because they became the leading authority in anatomy almost until Harvey's times, just like Aristotle in physics, for example. Today, this deep attachment to an ancient author sounds strange, but if we see things in perspective, it makes a lot of sense. In the Middle Ages, everyone knew that Galen had based most of his anatomical claims on dissections that he had performed. If Galen had already extensively observed the interior of the body and written about it, why should we do it all again? Their attachment to Galen was such that if a student or professor found things in a corpse that did not exactly match descriptions in a book, they thought that they were wrong rather than the anatomy book. Those who have studied anatomy recently probably went through similar experiences. Has anyone studied anatomy in the university here or medicine? No, just because you're at Oxford, it's a different place. But if you had done that, or you can just imagine it, right? It is a very messy and bloody event, right? So if you see odd things in the body that doesn't match the book, I mean, you think, I'm probably not seeing it right. So dissections actually only started being done for the first time in the early 1300s. But things really only began to change in anatomical research with Andreas Vesalius in the Renaissance, so 200 years later, and about 100 years before Harvey discovered the circulation of the blood. Thus the real question is, what happened in late medieval Europe that made physicians turn to human dissections for the first time in many, many, many hundreds of years? And why did it happen in Italy and not elsewhere? Now, to answer these questions, let's shift our attention to our first incorrupt body located in the medieval city of Montefalco in Umbria, Italy. There, in August of 1308, at an Augustinian monastery, the mother abbess, Chiara of Montefalco, died. Now, Umbria is the region of Italy where tourists go today to eat truffles and drink some of the best Italian wine. And you may not be surprised if I told you that at that hour, the nuns were not particularly interested in eating truffles and drinking wine. What they were interested in doing, however, may surprise you. After the death of Chiara, the nuns brought her body to repose in the monastery's main church. And at this stage, then as now, corpses should be embalmed so that they remain in respectable conditions for the wake and funeral. If nothing is done to a dead body, bacteria will decompose it. In a few hours, the body will smell bad, and in a few days, sometimes only one, parts of the body become visually putrefied. And I'm sorry, for saying these things here after dinner. This process of decomposition is especially faster in humid and warm conditions, such as the weather conditions in Montefalco in that month of August. And if you have ever been to Italy in the summer, you know what I'm talking about. Embalming dead bodies was not uncommon in the Middle Ages, especially in the case of important people like a mother abbess. But medieval embalming processes were quite inefficient compared to modern ones. So that you have a sense of what I am talking about, the best techniques of embalming were applied to the bodies of popes, just like they did to Pope Francis a little over than a month ago. But in the Middle Ages, this process lasted only about 9 days, which provided about enough time for a novena to be said for the dead pope. But what about Chiara of Montefalco? According to the testimony of one of the nuns who was present, which provides the basis for my account tonight, the nun's body was not immediately embalmed and rested in church for about 5 days. Yet, contrary to what was expected, the body did not undergo any major decay and actually dispersed a good perfume. This perfume was often associated with the bodies of saints, often called the odor of sanctity. For instance, when the tomb of Saint Dominic, founder of the Dominican order, was opened 3 years after he died in 1224, people were inebriated by the intense and good perfume coming from the tomb. Now, as the eyewitness nun later told, after 5 days of incorruption, all the nuns agreed, quote, that the body should be preserved on account of her holiness, and because God took such pleasure in her body and in her heart. Therefore, the nun continues, 3 sisters went to cut open the body, and one of them cut it open from the back with her own hand, as they had decided. They took out the entrails and put the heart away in a box, and they buried the entrails in the oratory that evening. But the story does not end here. According to Chiara herself, the suffering Christ once appeared to her with the cross, saying that he wanted to plant it on her heart. From then on, Chiara would repeat to the other nuns, quote, I have Jesus crucified inside my heart. For that reason, that same night, after Vespers, the same eyewitness said that the smaller group of nuns, quote, went to get the heart, which was in the box, as they later told the other nuns, and the same sister cut open the heart with her own hands, and opening it, they found in the heart a cross or the image of the crucified Christ. That is, the nuns found what they were looking for, a crucifix made of fleshy tissue inside her abbess's heart. And don't worry, I'll show you some photographs, okay? So, encouraged by these findings, the nuns kept exploring the heart the next day. They found more pieces of flesh and nerves in the form of the crown of thorns, the whip and column, the lance and sponge, and even the nails of the crucifixion. Furthermore, the nuns returned to Chiara's buried entrails and noticed that inside the gallbladder there were 3 round stones, which they associated with the symbol of the Holy Trinity, because they had the same weight and shape. Wanting further confirmation of what they saw, the nuns called the official physician of the monastery, who confirmed everything the nuns showed him. Too excited to contain the news, the nuns carried Chiara's heart to a nearby church, where, quote, they displayed it to a host of townspeople, several of whom were healed by its miraculous power. Now, Chiara's body is still venerated today in Montefalco. The skin, although dry, remains intact. More importantly, visitors and pilgrims can still see with their eyes the instruments of Christ's passion that were found inside her heart. I was there 2 years ago, and I took these photos myself. On the left, you can see the fleshy crucifix at the center of a cross-shaped reliquary, surrounded by 3 gallstones representing, of course, the Trinity, and in each extremity of the reliquary. And at the bottom of the same reliquary, there is the whip, you can see it here at the center, made of flesh, and in another container, there is a part of the dried heart. This bizarre story related to the body of Chiara of Montefalco raises important points about what are incorrupt bodies in the history of the Catholic Church and what significance do they have. So, first, an incorrupt body does not have to be undecomposed for a long period like we tend to assume. As you saw, after 5 days, the nuns wanted to preserve Chiara's body by embalming it. Second, there are other physical details associated with incorrupt bodies that have little to do with decomposition. For instance, Chiara's body produced a good perfume and it had special objects inside it. And third, the body and its parts seemed to operate miracles. It was this combination of special features that turned bodies into special objects of veneration in medieval and early modern Catholic devotion. For these reasons, I prefer to name them as holy corpses rather than incorrupt bodies. It is also important to note that these extraordinary phenomena had an important role as devotional objects, but they were not necessarily considered to be miracles. Although holy corpses were enough to trigger a canonization proceeding, they did not always count as evidence for miracles. In fact, 10 years after Chiara of Montefalco died, the Catholic Church opened a legal canonization process in which more than 400 people witnessed to Chiara's holy life and miracles. Yet the medieval process proved unsuccessful, and in fact Chiara was only canonized in the 19th century. But now you're probably thinking, what does this all have to do with science? Well, it is related at various levels. First, this manipulation of dead bodies by religious sisters shows that medieval Christians were not skeptical of opening bodies, not that they thought there was a need to preserve bodily integrity for Last Judgment. Indeed, tearing bodies of saints apart was not rare at all in the Middle Ages, regardless of whether the body was incorrupt or not. An interesting case is the fragmentation of the body of Saint Dominic, the founder of the Dominican order. We know this because decades ago, in the beginning of the 20th century, the Dominicans decided to X-ray the tomb of Saint Dominic in the early 20th century. So the radiography still exhibited at the Chiesa di San Domenico in Bologna shows an entirely dismembered body without the head. And in fact, the head is preserved there, but in a different reliquary. This practice of fragmentation allowed for different relics to travel from place to place for devotional practices. Another example from the Dominican order is that of Saint Catherine of Siena. Catherine died in Rome, and the Roman Dominicans did not let go of her body, which is still there today. But how to accommodate the needs of her followers in Siena and elsewhere in Italy? Easy. So her head was sent back home to Siena and her right foot to the Dominicans in Venice. And both can still be seen and venerated today. Christians dismembered bodies of saints, however, since the first millennium due to their devotion to the holy martyrs. What then is special about the case of Chiara Montefalco? Well, the answer lies in the digging, right? That you are probably shocked that I did not yet comment on the surreal scene of nuns cutting up bodies at night in a medieval convent and finding devotional objects inside her abbess's body. And the case of Chiara of Montefalco is especially striking because of the naturalness with which the nuns touched their Mother Superior's body. As the eyewitness narrated, the sister who opened Chiara for the first time, quote, cut the body open from the back with her own hands. And to do this, she had to remove some of the clothing of the abbess, roll her body upside down on the table, and push and drag the knife through her skin and bones with blood pouring all over, And even more striking is the way they dealt with the entrails, digging through the heart and the gallbladder in search of miraculous evidence. And this is indeed the first known case of devotees searching for things inside the body of a potential saint. But Chiara's story isn't far from being unique. 10 years later, in a nearby town, when the Dominican nun Margaret of Città di Castello died, her fellow religious sisters had her heart open in church, and inside they found 3 stones engraved with images of the Holy Family. They then exhibited the stones to what her biographer called, quote, a multitude of friars. And I don't have photos of the stones, unfortunately, I don't even know where they are. But her body can still be seen and venerated in Città di Castello. Although much of it has decayed, the arms and legs are still intact, the skin is dried up, and the hands and feet still have nails. But yet again, what does this have to do with science? About 30 years ago, historian of science Catherine Park, now professor emerita at Harvard University, noticed that this practice of digging inside the bodies of saints not only started with Chiara of Montefalco, but also did not exist outside of Italy. She then argued that the dissection of Chiara of Montefalco was part of a larger cultural momentum in which bodies were first opened for autopsies in other contexts. For instance, there is evidence that physicians opened a few bodies in the late 1200s to gain information about the physical state of someone who died. The same also happened for public health reasons, to try to understand bodily changes caused by plagues. Opening the bodies of saints was just an extension of this autopsy inquiry into the religious realm. That is, the Montefalco nuns were searching for physical marks of holiness in the body of Chiara. Now, precedents of these physical signs in saints already existed, and the most famous of which are the stigmata of Saint Francis of Assisi, whose hands displayed the physical marks of Christ's passion. Interior signs also appeared in another extraordinary holy corpse, that of Saint Anthony of Padua, who died in 1231. When Franciscan friars exhumed his body 30 years after his death, they found that the body had decomposed except for his tongue and larynx, which can still be seen and venerated for the disgust of many tourists at St. Anthony's Basilica in Padua. Now, why did these dissection cases start in Italy and not elsewhere, for instance, here in England? Well, part of the reason is theological. It turns out that the belief in the immediate separation of body and soul was unique to Italian culture and theology. Christians in medieval Italy opened dead bodies so easily because they believed that at the moment of death, there was a radical separation between body and soul. No personhood was left in the body. As St. Thomas Aquinas put it in the Summa Theologica, quote, "The relics of the saints are senseless, and a dead body is not of the same species as a living body." Then as now, Christians understood death as a temporary separation between body and soul. Again, quoting St. Thomas, "The union of the soul with the body is dissolved by death, even in the case of Christ." This cultural and religious phenomenon also shaped the science of anatomical practice. Only 8 years after Chiara of Montefalco's death, the first anatomy textbook mentioning human dissections after antiquity appeared. From here, it did not take long for other Italian universities across Italy to use dissections in their teaching curricula. Strikingly, it would not be until a century and a half later that universities in England, France, and Germany adopted dissections in their programs, which confirms the uniqueness of medieval Italy. In short, dissections came to be adopted in Europe, but very gradually, and it was mostly in the teaching environment. Well, but what about research? Did this practice of dissections change what was known about the body? In short, it did not until the Renaissance. So let's move on to the Renaissance. The most significant figure in this movement was Andreas Vesalius, whose richly illustrated book on the fabric of the human body highlighted the importance of dissections in research. One of Vesalius' discoveries had a lasting impact on the discovery of the circulation of the blood. And so it is worth following here in detail, because the science involved in this discovery also matters to the understanding of another holy corpse that we'll look at. So for Galen and everyone else in the Renaissance, including Vesalius, veins and arteries were completely independent systems. In Galenic anatomy, the liver produces blood and sends it to the heart through the veins. The heart, in turn, infuses vital spirits in the blood, creating what we today call arterial or oxygenated blood, which then reaches the body through arteries. But for a link between the veins and the arteries to exist, Galen postulated that there was a connection between the right and left ventricles of the heart. However, Vesalius noticed in his dissections that the septum of the human heart was not permeable, thus creating a crucial problem in anatomy. So how did the blood goes from the veins to the arteries. There's no circulation, right? So what happens after this? Well, the next discovery in this field was done by a man called Realdo Colombo, a student of Vesalius, who discovered that arterial blood acquired its specific properties not in the heart, but in the lungs. After making a few vivisections, that is, after opening the bodies of animals alive, he argued that venous blood leaves the heart, enters the lungs, and comes back to the heart as arterial blood, a circuit today known as pulmonary transit. Now, what does this have to do, right? Well, Colombo wrote this discovery in a book whose cover you see here, where he wanted to highlight his dissection skills over those of other anatomists, including Vesalius, his professor. And perhaps because of that, the book's last part was an account of things rarely seen in anatomy. And in fact, one of the cases he mentions in that final chapter was the opening of the corpse of one of the most famous priests in Rome at the time, a man called Ignatius of Loyola, whom you probably know as the founder of the Society of Jesus. Colombo found unusual stones inside his liver, which Loyola's disciples took as confirmation that the saint endured extreme pain in his final years. But he did not consider this as a miraculous thing, neither was the body incorrupt. However, the body of one of Ignatius of Loyola's friends did turn out to be incorrupt, namely that of Francis Xavier. The Spanish Jesuit died in China after an incredibly productive missionary life, and to send his body back from China to Goa, in India, Francis Xavier's friends had to wait until the body decomposed because no captain would accept a rotten body on board a long voyage. Therefore, they buried his body in the ground and covered it with lime, which was a process that they thought accelerated bodily decomposition. However, when the body was exhumed 2 months later, they found it incorrupt. The incorruption was so remarkable that the corpse was even accepted on board a ship to Goa. The body even produced wondrous signs. In the Renaissance, as in the Middle Ages, it was common for devotees to steal relics with their teeth by biting part of it when pretending to venerate it with a kiss. And there is in fact an interesting book about this called Furta Sacra, which means sacred thefts. However, when someone tried to bite one of Francis Xavier's toes and bring a relic back home, it started bleeding fresh blood. More surprisingly, 60 years after Francis Xavier's death, the Pope asked the Jesuits to send one of his arms to Rome, the arm that he used to baptize so many people. When the Jesuits opened the decades-old casket, one of the eyewitnesses noticed that, quote, the body's right eye was open and so fresh that he seemed to be alive. And his cheeks were too, and the fingers with which he held the divine sacrament. It seemed a miraculously preserved body, even to the physicians in Goa who wrote reports about it. Yet these local reports were insufficient for the church to recognize this miracle. Instead, the church wanted an extra doctor from Rome to confirm all the Asian reports, which indeed is what happened. The incorrupt body of Francis Xavier became one of the miracles that led to his canonization, which happened on March 12, 1622, the same day as Ignatius of Loyola, Philip Neri, and Teresa of Avila, which is quite the day in the history of the church. Now, the reasons why Rome wanted European physicians to assess the evidence are many. One of them was because of their being up to date with the most recent anatomical knowledge. The physician who confirmed Francis Xavier's bodily incorruption was Angelo Vittori, a doctor who was well informed of Realdo Colombo's research on the heart. And in fact, he applied that research to the body of another holy corpse in Rome, that of Saint Philip Neri, with whom we started our talk. Unlike the body of Francis Xavier, whose main feature was not decomposing, the corpse of Philip Neri, as we already saw, exhibited a very large heart and pulmonary artery. Vittori even published a small booklet about this special heart, showing that medical texts about a holy corpse could actually build one CV in the Renaissance. And so all the expert physicians were unanimous in their opinion on a possible miracle. They all agreed that Philip's enlarged heart was the result of an aneurysm. However, the fact that he lived many decades with it and associated the aneurysm heart attack with a specific vision seemed to be possible only due to divine intervention. and the heart attack could be traced to a night when Philip had the mystical experience of a globe of fire entering his chest and exploding inside. One of the doctors explained that Philip's fervor brought a rush of vital spirits to the heart. Now, if you remember Galen's anatomy, this makes sense because the heart was the organ that endowed vital spirits to the blood. Here's the Galenic system of blood. But the physicians noticed that the pulmonary artery was also enlarged. What did this mean? Vittorio did not want this detail to escape, and so took his account of what happened to another level. He explained that Philip Neri's meditative abilities did bring in more vital spirits, but they emerged not in the heart, but in the lungs. This focus on the lungs instead of the heart means that he interpreted Philip Neri's body in light of the pulmonary transit, only discovered a few years before. For Galen, lungs did not matter for the blood systems, but for Colombo, they were the place where arterial blood acquired vital spirits. That is why the enlarged pulmonary artery, which brought blood from the heart to the lungs, mattered for their analysis. In short, Vittorio used Philip Neri's holy corpse to display his commitment to cutting-edge anatomical research. More importantly, whereas in the Middle Ages, holy corpses contributed to the culture that originated dissections in anatomy, in the Renaissance, the new dissection-based anatomy was shaping the examination of holy corpses significantly. I want now to turn to one of the final episodes that testifies even more to the influence of science in the examination of these corpses. And this was the body of Caterina Vigri, or Saint Catherine of Bologna. Catherine was the abbess of a Poor Clares monastery whose incorrupt body remains seated since 1463 in a prominent chair at the Corpus Domini Church in Bologna. That is, the remains of the body have been like this for 562 years. And you can still see it in Bologna, though mostly through a window. The cloistered nuns only open her chapel one day a week. And I did not get in. I could not. It was not the day I was there. Catherine's incorrupt body had been used as a miracle for her beatification in the early 1500s. But since the body remained incorrupt for 100 years, the promoters of her cause in the early 1670s decided to use it again as a miracle for the canonization. And as part of the process, a group of 8 physicians was sent to the monastery for an ocular and manual inspection of the body. One of them, this is in the second half of the 17th century, was Marcello Malpighi, a fellow of the Royal Society of London, and in a nice turn of events, the doctor who discovered with the microscope the blood capillaries that transformed venous blood into arterial blood in the lungs. So the second major discovery after the circulation of the blood. After their examination of the body, the doctors admitted that Catherine's body was special, but most of them, including Malpighi, thought the skin was too dry and not as soft as expected. The body could have been incorrupt originally, and its skin, although dry, was still remarkably preserved, but they could not state the reason was purely supernatural. When Rome finally decided to review this process, one of the actors involved was a man called Prospero Lambertini, who would later become Pope Benedict XIV. As a cardinal from Bologna, Lambertini lavished his support on the University of Bologna's anatomical theater and medical library, and he even created a new museum and school for anatomical wax modeling, the first in the world. As a churchman from Bologna, Lambertini confessed having left, quote, no stone unturned to reach the goal of having the holy body's incorruption recognized as a miracle. Yet when he read the physician's report, he simply had to accept the expert's decision that her incorruption did not seem miraculous. Catherine was indeed canonized, but the church's report explicitly stated that Catherine's bodily incorruption was, quote, no longer extant. The miracles used were healing miracles, and confirmed by the same doctors. Nonetheless, Catherine's holy corpse continues to be one of the main sources for her popular devotion. Now, I started this talk by showing that opening holy corpses culturally contributed to the rise of anatomical dissections in medieval Italy. And as dissections increased in popularity, its reliance on observations and rigor also increased, including within church reports. As I mentioned, Philip Neri's autopsy made use of the recent discovery of the pulmonary transit of the blood, even before the discovery of the circulation. And by the early 18th century, things were even stricter, and the scientific assessment of holy corpses even affected whether they should be considered a miracle or not. After Malpighi's skepticism towards Catherine Incorrupt body, Cardinal Lambertini developed a much more rigorous categorization of incorruption. And the result has been that since then, no incorrupt body has been officially declared a miracle by the Catholic Church. Now, some of you may have heard of the recent case of the Benedictine African-American Sister Wilhelmina Lancaster. Sister Lancaster died in 2019 at the age of 95. And when her fellow Benedictine sisters exhumed her body 4 years later, in April 2023, the corpse was found incorrupt. What was the result? Well, many pilgrims started driving to this monastery in Missouri to see and venerate the abbess's body by themselves. Even, New York Times went there. Just like in medieval and early modern times, holy corpses still are key accelerators for someone's sainthood. But what will the Vatican say? Perhaps nothing different from what Cardinal Lambertini once told a Protestant Englishman who visited Rome. The cardinal showed the Englishman evidence of miracles being examined in the Roman Curia. The Anglican answered he was impressed, acknowledging that these miracles would be very hard to refute. Strikingly, Lambertini replied that, quote, "Of all these miracles, which seems to you to be so firmly established, not one has been approved by the Sacred Congregation of Saints, since the proofs were rejected as insufficient." The truth is, from the Middle Ages until today, holy corpses and science have never been enemies. Rather, they have been partners in a quest to know the truth about God, nature, and sainthood. Thank you very much.